All right. Well, good morning, everybody, to the annual November workshop for Nevada County Camera Club. This is track 1 today that I'm facilitating, so I'll just be in the background as the presenters present. And so if you don't know me, I hope I know everybody, but if I don't, I'm Rachel Rosenthal. I'm the current president of the club. And so today we do this each November, used to be in person pre-COVID. And last year we did it on Zoom, worked out pretty darn well. So we're going to do that again this year. So this track has 4 workshops in it. The first one starting off with Eric Engles will do camera basics, and then there'll be a short break. And then Janice Rosner will do a class on introduction to lenses. And then we'll take a lunch break. And then after lunch, we've got Rick Eshelman on advanced editing techniques in Lightroom. Again, a short break. And then a final workshop today in this track is Preparing Your Image for Display by David Wong. And so as you can tell, this is track 1. There is a track 2 facilitated by Douglas Hooper. It's a separate Zoom link. So you're either going to have to log out of this and then log into the track 2 Zoom. I don't know if you can do it with 2 tabs. I was going to try that myself and be in 2 Zoom rooms. I don't know if you can do that. Be logged into 2 different Zoom meetings at the same time. I'm going to try that. But no matter what, both tracks are being recorded and both will be posted on the club's website in a few days after the videos have been rendered, and they'll be under meeting videos. You have to log in to the club's website, go down that right-hand list of links and go to meeting videos, and you'll be able to find both of these tracks. If all goes well, the tech gods are with us today. So let's see what else. I said I'm going to be in the background watching and helping if needed, and muting people if the background noise becomes problematic. But each presenter will tell you kind of what they want to do. I'm going to watch the chat. If you have a question, you can put it in chat, but each presenter also may tell you if they just want you to speak up and ask questions during their presentation. So they'll let you know. And also just comment at the end of the day or during your presentation, be sure to thank your presenters. I mean, these folks are club members, generously sharing their expertise and experience with all of us today. So please let them know how much you appreciate it. You know, they get paid like buckets of money to do this, not. So, you know, a thank you goes a long way. So really appreciate the work that they put in to get ready for today. And then if there's any issues, please text me. My text number is actually the code you put in. And you can look it up on the club's website too, but I'm at 530-268-7268, and text me. I've got my phone here in front of me in case there's technical issues. Dave Arstein's also standing by today to help me and Douglas and other club members if needed. So, all right. Okay. That did not take 15 minutes. Does anybody have any questions? That's how much I allotted for that. Okay. Everybody ready to rock and roll? All right. So I'm going to turn it over to our first presentation is to Eric Engles on camera basics, and let him take it away. So with that, Eric, I turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks. It's great to see everybody. I see that some participants I know are somewhat experienced with using cameras, but I don't know a lot of the rest of you. So I'm assuming that you're not super experienced. But I am going to assume that you have a camera that does certain things. In particular, it's we're going to cover the semi-automatic modes that are that you choose generally in the top of your camera. This little guy here, and it gives you the ability to do aperture priority and shutter priority. And we're going to be talking about those sorts of things. And during the workshop, it would be good if you had your camera available in hand. I'm going to be showing a lot of slides, but then getting out of the slide mode and having you actually pick up your camera and try stuff. Not lots of that, but some. One other thing is that this is definitely not a camera specific kind of workshop. Every camera does these things we're going to talk about very differently. Even in the same brand, there's huge differences. Like I have two Canon cameras, and they deal with autofocus and exposure settings totally differently. There's very different dials and different menu screens and all that. And I don't know how all the cameras differ. So that's something that you have to figure out for your particular camera. So I'll be going over more conceptual things that will then help you, then guide you in learning how to use your own camera. Okay, that's the basic idea of what we're doing. Let's see. Well, I'm going to start by talking about autofocus. And that means I'm going to switch to a PowerPoint slide thing. And that's what you'll be seeing on your screen. And you'll hear me talking, however. Okay. So the first basic point is that to have more control over the focusing ability of your camera does not mean that you're going to be using manual focus. It means that, although you might want to use manual focus sometimes for certain things, it's a matter of learning how to control your camera's autofocus capabilities, which are quite extraordinary. In the olden days, when you had to focus manually, that was something that a lot of people did very well at, but it takes a little bit of time and skill and patience, but having your camera be able to do it is a great thing. So what's the camera doing when it's autofocusing? It's looking at the image on the sensor and analyzing certain spots on the sensor while moving the lens in and out. And it's looking for the highest contrast it gets between different pixels, and it knows that something's focused when that happens. So when you, this is something that's very, very basic, and I'm sure all you know this, but autofocus happens when you press the shutter button. And if you hold the button down just halfway, the camera autofocuses but doesn't take a picture. And that's a very important thing to know. As I said, you probably all know this, but it's quite crucial. So you might want to hold up your camera, turn it on, hold up your camera, and look in the viewfinder. Cameras are different this way, but if you look in the viewfinder and press the shutter button down halfway, you should see autofocus points or zones in the viewfinder. And that's the camera telling you what it's doing with autofocusing. And I believe that most cameras by default have a little beep that happens when it focuses on a certain point and decides that's where I'm going to focus. And it also lights up. Mine has a little red light that goes on at that little point. That's autofocus working in your camera. Now, to control how this works, there's two things that you do. You can choose which points are being used, and you can choose how the autofocus mode operates on your camera. So the first part, selecting your autofocus points, there's two basic ways this happens. And again, this varies by camera. The first is automatic selection, where the camera does the work of selecting which points to use for autofocusing. So one way to think about this is that it's automatic. It's two levels of auto. And what generally happens is the camera chooses a bunch of different points on the sensor all over the image and averages the values and decides, okay, this is about where the focus should be. And so the other choice you have is you choose a single autofocus point. Some cameras, it's actually more than one point, but that's the basic idea, is you're choosing a certain place on the image in which to focus. And so you can think of this as manual automatic focus. And the reason you might want to do that is to have more control over where the camera is focusing, because it might decide your subject is one place in the image, but you really want to focus on some other part of the image. And so by choosing your own autofocus point, that lets you do that. So the matter of autofocus mode is a little different. Cameras basically have two autofocus modes. One is where it's suited to just taking a landscape photo or a portrait where the subject is not moving. And that's called one-shot mode. And in that mode, the point that the camera chooses for focusing when you hold the shutter button down halfway stays locked, and then the lens doesn't move after that. And then in the other mode that you can use, my Canon calls it AI servo mode. And in that mode, and other cameras might call it something different, the camera refocuses as the subject moves. So what's going on there is that the camera is actually detecting the movement of the subject, and it's adjusting the focus to compensate for that. And as you might guess, that mode is really good for taking photos of things that are moving, like wildlife or someone running or a race car or something like that. And modern cameras have gotten really good at that. And there's special things you can do to control that too. But knowing the difference between those two modes is very important, because it's often something that you want to have set before you start taking pictures. There's some cameras also have a mode that's kind of in between the two of them. My Canon calls it AI focus, and it's basically both of them at once, which means that the focus locks as it would in one shot, but if the subject moves, then it turns into a servo mode. So if you just have that set on your camera all the time, then you kind of have the benefits of both modes. And that's often what I do, actually. Although, sort of interestingly, my really good Canon camera doesn't have that AI focus mode. So again, you're going to see different cameras have different choices. Okay, so here's something that everyone should know how to do, even if you don't end up using it a lot. And this is something they don't tell you about doing when you buy your camera and look at the owner's manual. This is a way of using the autofocus capabilities of the camera, but having quite a bit of control over what actually gets focused on in your image. So at this point, you probably want to pick up your camera and actually try this in the room where you are. If there's enough light, it'll work. So that's the first thing to do, is to get to the screen on your camera where you choose which autofocus point to be using for autofocus. So that would be a manual selection. And the best point to choose is the one at the very center. And then you also want to be in one shot autofocus mode. So when you have those two selected on your camera, and you then point the camera at something and hold the shutter button down halfway, and the camera will lock onto the point at the very center as the place where it's focusing. So you roughly compose your scene and decide, okay, this is about the photo that I want to take. Then you want to move the camera so that that center point is focusing on the place in the scene that you want to be most in focus, which may not be the center. Okay, and then hold the shutter button down to lock focus on that spot, and then move the camera back to where it was to compose your scene. And then you take the picture. This is a way that gives you total control over where exactly in the image is most in focus. And it's something that's pretty much the only way that I do focusing now. And you'll need to choose different kinds of points depending on what kind of photos you're taking. If you're doing landscape photos, you want to choose a focus point that's maybe about a third of the way into the scene, from the foreground to the background. And that way you'll have the greatest depth of field. If you're doing portrait, obviously you want to focus right on the person's eyes when you're doing this. Even if they're not in the middle of the frame, you can still do that by using this method. Was everybody able to do that with their cameras? Are there questions about how you get into one-shot mode or anything like that? Feel free to unmute yourselves and speak up if you like. Well, everybody's got that? Okay.
Eric, I've got Bonnie says, yes, it worked.
It worked. Okay. Okay, good. Good. Okay, so I recommend that you practice this particular method, or go all the other way to using auto, where you just let the camera do the focusing. And you can fine tune that in most cameras by choosing which zone the autofocus is occurring in. But cameras are really good at that. So if you just let the camera decide what should be in focus, it usually does a really good job of it. Okay, so our other topics are a little more complicated, so I want to leave enough time for that. And but the other thing I'll say about autofocus is there are lots of other things to learn about how your camera works regarding focus. And these are things we won't go over, but they're things to think about learning as you take more photos and learn how your camera works. Some cameras have touch screen selection, which is very, very cool, but can be confusing, where you touch the place on the screen that you want to have it focus. And a lot of cameras have very fine control over how the servo mode works. So if you're taking photos of moving birds or something, you can have it do exactly what you want. Some cameras will lock onto a person's face or eyes and track them as they move. And that's really cool. And you can also set up your camera so that focus happens not when you hold down the shutter button, but when you press a button on the back of the camera. And that can be a really great thing to do to separate the taking of the picture from the automatic focusing. So those are just things to keep in mind as you get better using your camera. Okay, so now I want to switch to the topic of exposure, which is far more complicated, but it has simple elements. So what you're seeing on your screen here is a diagram of how a camera works. It seems very basic, but there's a lot to this. There are three things that control basically how much light gets into the camera and is used to make an image. There's the aperture in the lens, and then there's the shutter, and then there's the sensor itself. Each of these things has the effect of letting in less light or more light, or in the case of the sensor, the equivalent of that. So the big point here is that with these three things to think about all at once, including, and then also the amount of light that is in the environment you're taking a picture of, you have to balance these three things. Because clearly, if you let in lots of light through the aperture, and then you let it in for a long time through the shutter, and the sensor is very sensitive, your image is going to be overexposed. It's going to have much more light than it needs. On the other hand, if you don't let in very much light through the aperture, and you don't let it in for a very long time through the shutter, and your sensor is not sensitive, then your image is going to be underexposed. So you have to balance the way that these different things work. And luckily, the camera does a lot of this work for you. But understanding how these three things interact with each other is very important. So this slide contains a lot of the information that you really need to know to work with exposure. I'll spend some time going over all this. So I've made the different aspects of these elements have different colors to show something important. So the things in red are things that are always bad that you want to avoid. image blur in green is something that may be good or may be bad. And the things in black are things that just depend on what you want. The point of all this is that when you're balancing these different things that have to do with light, other things happen too that affect your image. It's not just the amount of light. With aperture, which is the size of the entrance pupil in your lens, you can let in more light or less light, but a small aperture and a large aperture have totally different effects on your image. And the biggest thing to think about is the depth of field. And that is the amount, the distance in your image front to back that is in focus. When you're taking an image of a person, you generally want just the person to be in focus and the background to be blurred. That would be a situation where you have shallow depth of field. If you're taking a picture of a landscape, you're likely to want everything from the foreground really close to you to the far background to be in focus. And that's wide depth of field. And so how you get wide depth of field is you have a very small and the shallow depth of field, you want a very large aperture. So this matter of depth of field then is laid on top of the matter of how much light, which makes things complicated. Because if you want really wide depth of field and you choose a narrow aperture, you're greatly limiting the amount of light that goes into the camera. And so you have to compensate for that with shutter speed and ISO. On the other hand, if you're opening up the aperture a lot, you're letting in tons of light, and then your shutter speed is going to need to be fast in order to reduce the amount of light that's actually hitting the sensor. So all these factors change as you're doing different things, and they also change when your light environment is different. With aperture, if you choose a wide aperture, you start to get, in addition to shallow depth of field, you start to get aberrations in the image. That's because the lens is using more of the edge area to produce the image, and the edges of lenses can't be designed to be perfect. They have like something like 6 different forms of aberration that occur. So in any particular lens, the widest aperture that it has always has this trade-off of producing an image that has some aberration, especially at the edges. And at the other end of where you have a narrow aperture in your lens, you start to get into the issue of lens diffraction, which is different. This happens because you're squeezing the light through a little hole, and because light has the nature of waves, it's bouncing off the edges of that aperture, and that's changing it, and it's causing the light to bump into each other at the edges, and that creates noticeable lack of clarity in your image. And so that occurs at the narrowest apertures of any lens. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't use narrow aperture, but you need to be aware that that's what starts to occur at the smallest apertures. So with any lens, there's this nice sweet spot in the middle, where the lens is open part way, and you don't get aberrations when you don't get diffraction. Most people think of f8 as that sweet spot, and you generally get the best images from your lens at about f8. The numbers that I've put here on this slide, f2 and f22, those are just for reference. Those are examples of very wide apertures and very narrow apertures. Some lenses don't even go up to f22. They stop at f16 or something like that. And other lenses don't go down as low as f2. I'll get into that in just a second. And then in the area of shutter speed, there's nothing that happens that's bad when you have a fast shutter speed. But when you have a low shutter speed, what can happen is the image gets blurred either from the camera moving or the subject moving. So that's the main issue you're dealing with when you set the shutter speed, is I'm controlling how the likelihood of any blurring happening from those types of movement. And then with ISO, which controls the sensitivity of your sensor, there's nothing bad that happens at the low end of the sensitivity range. But at the high end, you get two problems happening. One is noise, and the other is reduced dynamic range. Every sensor has that problem of having less dynamic range at higher ISOs. And what that means is the sensor has more difficulty in rendering the brightest light and the less bright light, and telling the difference between the two. That ability goes down the higher your ISO setting is. Okay. So when you're looking at these three elements of exposure, there are a bunch of things that you need to think about that come into play. And these questions aren't things that you have to answer now or worry about the answers to. My point is just that these kinds of questions do come into play. So one is how much light there is. That's also always a crucial thing when you're taking photos. How much light do I have? And then another thing is how much depth of field do I want in this image that I'm making? Do I want the background to be blurred, or do I want it to be crisp and in focus? Another question is the subject moving or not? That affects your shutter speed. Another consideration is what kind of lens you're using, because the different lenses have different aperture ranges, and different focal lengths affect all of these things. And then there's the matter of what kind of image you want, whether it's a portrait or landscape or macro. All those things affect depth of field, and other things. And you might want some kind of special effect. Like you may actually want your subject to be blurred, or if it's a windy day, for their hair to look blurred, something like that. Or you might want the flowing water in a stream to look blurred. And then another issue is whether your camera and lens combination has some kind of image stabilization. That really changes how you do this balancing of the three exposure elements. And then a tripod, of course, changes the whole thing because it keeps the camera steady, and so does accessory lighting. It will add more lighting. So these are all, and there are all sorts of other things you probably think of too, but these are the main questions that you need to ask yourself when you're taking a photo.
So Eric, we do have another question,
Okay.
which is what happens to the actual photo as the result of aberrations?
Oh, that's just sort of fuzziness around the edges. It's often not noticeable. I think it's less of an issue than the diffraction that happens with a smaller aperture. I haven't really noticed it that much myself when I use a wide aperture. But it's just sort of a lack of clarity at the edges of the image is really mainly what it is, which is sometimes something good, really. Yeah. So it isn't a big deal. It's just something to be aware of. It's far more important to like get the right background blur than to worry about any lens aberrations that are happening. Okay. So one thing that confuses lots of people when they're starting out in photography is what the f-stop numbers mean. This is something I'm not an expert on, but it's I want to go over some of the basics. So one thing to know is that f number is a ratio. That's the focal length to the aperture diameter, and so it depends on both the size of the aperture and the focal length of the lens. And that's why you'll see for certain zoom lenses that the smallest aperture number that it can have varies depending on where you are in that zoom range. But because this is a ratio that's actually the inverse, the f number is the inverse of this ratio. That means that you have this weird situation where the smaller your aperture, the larger the f number. It's sort of counterintuitive. So the very smallest apertures that most people shoot at, which is f16, f22, f32, those are pretty big numbers, but what they stand for is a very tiny aperture. And at the other end, low f numbers mean a wide aperture. So for most lenses, the lowest they go is 2.8 or so. And some lenses go to 4, and some even as high as 5.6. The more expensive lenses tend to go down to lower f numbers, and that can be very important when you want to let in more light. And then most lenses have the smallest aperture f values of 16 to 32. So another thing that's can be important to understand is that there are these standard f-stop values. You've probably seen the range. The next slide is going to actually show this. It goes from f4 to f5.6 to f8 to f11. When you're moving up this sequence of f-stop numbers, each next number is letting in half as much light as the one before. And when you go the other direction, from like f8 to f5.6, you're letting in twice as much light. Okay, so this is something I stole from some website that gives you a visual feeling of aperture sizes in relation to those f numbers. As you can see, the aperture is controlled by these blades inside the lens that move in and out and produce something approximating a circle for the light to go through. And there's a pretty big difference between the widest ones that a lens can do and the narrowest ones. Okay, so now let's go to a matter of ISO.
Eric, before you go too far, we do have a good question posed about the lenses, which is how might image stabilization change your decision about settings?
Yeah, so different forms of image stabilization give you control that is measured in stops. And so, and that's sort of equivalent to that the f-stops stuff that I just talked about. So if you might normally need as much light as is brought in through f4, but you have image stabilization of 4 stops, you could actually shoot that same photo at 4 settings higher than that, which is quite a bit. The way that I like to think about it is that that stabilization is just giving me a little bit of extra protection in that that it's the image I'm getting is going to be even crisper than I thought it might be based on the settings that I have. And it's just making things a little easier, but the camera to some extent is taking that into account too when it's doing its semi-automatic thing, which is what we'll get into in just a bit. Does that answer that question well enough?
I'm not sure, and I'd recommend the person who asks unmute yourself and feel free to respond to Eric.
Okay.
Or maybe not. Okay.
Okay.
Must be okay.
So ISO is really has to do with the sensitivity of the sensor with regard to light. What it functionally is really is the amount of voltage that comes out of each pixel when it's triggered by a certain amount of light. In film days, this same kind of sensitivity was produced with the chemistry of the film, and there were different standards for what the numbers meant, and the term ISO comes from film days, actually, when they were trying to coordinate 2 different kinds of sensitivity standards in film. ISO actually means International Standards Organization, and doesn't directly mean sensitivity, but that's what it's come to mean anyway. So one important thing to know is that every camera's sensor has a native ISO, which means that's the sensitivity that the camera is designed around and produces the best image quality. And that's generally the lowest ISO setting on that camera. For many cameras, it's 200. For some, it's 100. So all their things being equal, that's the best ISO setting to use. But sometimes you need to have more sensitivity to adjust for having somewhat less light. So that means that it's best to not use ISO settings above about 400 unless you really need to, because there isn't enough light. When you have an ISO setting that's about 3200 or higher, your image will be really noticeably grainy and noisy. And I'm going to skip ahead to the next slide to show you that. This is an image that I just found on the internet that had to do with fixing noise. But it shows you what an image looks like when you shoot at very high ISO. This was 12,800, which some cameras don't even go that high. This was probably taken near total darkness. You can see that it produces an image, but it's full of odd colors that aren't really there. That's what noise is each pixel producing a color that's actually different from what's there, because it's way overly sensitive and can't do a good job in judging what's really there. So any image that's taken with an ISO 400 or higher has some of this kind of noise in it. At ISO 400 or so, it's not really noticeable, but it gets noticeable at a certain level, and that depends on your camera. The newest cameras are good at reducing noise, but they can't get rid of it entirely. So going back to this, many cameras will have, even by default, a setting in which the ISO is set automatically. That's often not a good idea to use if you're looking for good image quality, because the camera may set the ISO high enough to produce noise. So I tend to not shoot at auto ISO at all. However, a lot of cameras have this nifty feature where you can set the maximum ISO that it'll use when it's in auto. This is found in the camera's menus, and it should be something that you can find fairly easily in the menus that control how the camera works. And different cameras work differently this way, but there's some place where you can choose what that maximum ISO will be, and you can set it at like 800 or something like that, so that even if the camera is choosing an automatic ISO setting, it's not going above 800 when it does so. So that's a good compromise. It gives the camera more flexibility in choosing settings. Another thing to know is that a lot of cameras have a way of very quickly changing your ISO setting with a button on the top of the camera or the back of the camera. It's often labeled ISO. And with that button, you can just very quickly change what the ISO setting is. Okay, so there's that high noise image. Okay, so the third thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. And in the realm of shutter speed, the biggest thing to think about is how it's controlling the possibility of the image being blurred. And this only applies when you're shooting handheld. It could also apply when the image is moving, even when you're using a tripod. But if you're shooting handheld, you need a shutter speed that's fast enough to make camera shake not an issue. And that shutter speed varies depending on the focal length of your lens. So for the longest time, photographers have used a rule of thumb about shutter speed, which is that it's equal to the focal length of your lens with a made into a fraction of 1 over that focal length. So if you have a 50 millimeter lens, or your zoom is set at 50 millimeters, you'll need a shutter speed of a 50th of a second to overcome the possibility of camera shake affecting your image. And that rule is still, I think, a very good rule as a general guideline. Some photographers will tell you that because modern sensors are able to resolve things so finely, you actually should have a shutter speed that's faster than that rule would dictate. On the other hand, when you have image stabilization, you can have a slower shutter speed than that rule would indicate. So what that tells me is that when you have a camera that has image stabilization and a good high resolution sensor, those two things cancel out and you end up following the rule anyway. Even if that's not quite true, it's close enough to being true that that's a really good rule to follow. Now you need to modify that rule when you're shooting a subject that's moving. When you're shooting something that's moving very fast, you really have to modify it. But the basic idea is you need a much faster shutter speed than that rule would indicate. And that's something for which there's no particular rule. It depends if you want a little bit of blur on that fast moving subject to show the viewer that it's moving, whether you want it to be totally crisp and you're capturing it in all its detail. But the kind of shutter speed that you might use for something moving pretty fast is like in the thousandths of a second, very, very typically. And that's something you need to experiment with. And then the other thing is that when you've got your camera mounted on a tripod and you're taking a picture of something that's not moving, you can use any shutter speed you want because camera shake is no longer an issue. But you have to be careful if you're taking a picture of a landscape with the camera on a tripod, because things in the landscape can move when it's windy. So if you don't want if it's windy and you don't want the leaves to be moving around and blurring, then you do need a higher shutter speed to capture those leaves in a certain spot without them blurring. Okay, so I want to tell a little story first before we get into this subject of semi-automatic. Um, I I participated in a camera club workshop a few years ago that was in person before the pandemic, and we talked about these same things, and the presenter talked about the semi-automatic modes of shooting, and afterwards, one of the participants who I know, who's a very experienced photographer, I heard him say, "Wow, I never knew that you could do that. I always thought that being a good photographer meant that I shot in manual." And it amazed me that this person had been taking photos for 20 years without knowing that, well, maybe not that long because digital cameras haven't existed that long necessarily, but I was amazed that he had been taking photos manually, thinking that that's what a professional does. And he wasn't making use of the fact that cameras do a lot of the work for you in balancing the three elements of the exposure triangle. So nearly for this reason, nearly every photographer, unless the situation is special for some reason, they use one of the semi-automatic modes. Um, and those are aperture priority or shutter priority. Um, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So how much time do I have, Rachel?
Eric, you're doing great. It's basically
Yeah.
10 o'clock. You have until 10:15.
Oh, okay. Good. Um, so the shooting mode that lots of photographers use as sort of the default is aperture priority. And when you're using this mode of shooting, the photographer, selects which aperture value you're going to use. And then the camera does the work of adjusting the shutter speed so that you get a normal exposure. And then if your ISO setting is on auto, the camera may also change the ISO setting. So this is really, really handy. And it basically allows you control over depth of field because you choose the aperture value that you want to get the depth of field that you want for your image. And then the camera does the work of changing everything else to make sure that the result is perfectly exposed. So this is what you need to use when you're doing portraits or anything like that, where you're taking a picture of a particular subject indoors or close by, or doing street photography or whatever. And then it's also what you want to use when you're doing landscape photos, where the goal is to have maximum depth of field, where everything is in focus from the very front of the image close to you to the very back. So it really serves a great number of purposes. So the one thing to think about when you're using the aperture priority shooting mode is when you're going for a broad depth of field, taking a landscape, it's possible that the camera will set the shutter speed to be slow enough that you get camera shake. It's not going to just stop because it knows there's going to be too much camera shake. You've got to check to see what it's doing and adjust things if that's happening. The The two adjustments you could make are to not have quite so small an aperture and sacrifice some of the depth of field, or raise the ISO, or put the camera on a tripod so that you can have a shutter speed that's slower. So those are the three options you have if that shutter speed is getting too slow. So when you take a photo and you look in your viewfinder, there's a reading down at the bottom that's showing you what that shutter speed is. So that's where you check to see what the camera is going to do. So you hold down the shutter button halfway and check to see what that number is. You've already set the aperture, but the camera is then telling you, okay, with that aperture setting, I'm going to be using this shutter speed. And you need to check that shutter speed to see if it's adequate for your lens focal length. So that's just sort of this thing that you do whenever you take a photo in aperture priority mode. Check that shutter speed. It's probably not an issue if you're using a wide aperture, however. So you can just go ahead and shoot with that because you can be sure that with the wide aperture, enough light's coming in that it's not a problem. Okay, so you may also want to use the shutter priority mode. In that mode, you might guess is that you, the user, are setting the shutter speed, and then the camera is adjusting the aperture, and it might also adjust the ISO. So you want control over the shutter speed when you're taking a picture of a moving subject. A race car, somebody running, a bird, a deer that's running, whatever. In those cases, you want to choose a very fast shutter speed. You also might want it when you're using a telephoto, even to take a picture of something that's not moving, because with a telephoto lens, there's a lot more sensitivity with regard to camera shake. So you might want to just make sure that the camera's shutter speed is fast enough to avoid any blur with your telephoto lens, using that rule of thumb. You also might want shutter priority mode if you're looking for, if you want blur in your photo, in which case you would set that shutter speed to be slower than the rule of thumb. So when you're using a fast shutter speed, you're letting in a lot less light. So for a shorter amount of time. So what the camera is going to do is make the aperture wider. But in doing so, it could be creating a shallower depth of field than you want. It's also possible that with some lenses, it actually can't, at a very high shutter speed, you can't, the lens can't actually open up the aperture wide enough to let in enough light for normal exposure. So in those cases, your only solution is to go to a higher ISO number. And so that's a recognized trade-off when you're using a very fast shutter speed, is you may have to use a high ISO and just tolerate the graininess and the noise. But the good thing to know about that is in post-processing, the noise that comes from high ISO settings can mostly be eliminated. There's a lot of software that does a really good job of getting rid of it. And so it may not be a bad thing to use that high ISO setting. So there's one more thing, two more things to know about with regard to exposure. One, and this can be very important for certain circumstances. Every camera has the ability to change how it calculates normal exposure. This is called exposure compensation, and it's one of the things that appears in the menu on the back of your camera when it's showing different settings. And it's typically a linear scale that with 0 in the middle. And when you change the exposure setting, basically you're telling the camera that it's okay to make an exposure that's lower than what it considers normal or higher than what it considers normal. Once you change this, then every photo you take after changing it is made according to that different setting. So you have to realize that you've done that. And because you might want to go back to the normal setting of 0. The other thing is that some people, based on their camera or their preferences for kinds of photos, they like to just pretty much keep their camera set to be to make images slightly less bright than what the camera thinks is normal. I often do that. I just reduce it by 1/3 of a stop so that the exposure compensation is slightly negative. But in general, exposure compensation is something that's specific to a certain situation where just because of the different parts of the image being bright, some being dark, your preference is for it to be a little different than what the camera might calculate based on averaging those two things.
So Eric, I just want to give you, you've got 5 minutes left. So
okay, well, I'm just about
with
done.
you, see if you wanted question and answer or keep going with your choice.
Yeah, I do want to leave a little time at the end. But let me just mention this one more thing, that the other thing to know about with regard to exposure is the metering mode of the camera. That's how the camera is examining the image on the sensor to calculate what normal exposure is. And so you might want to change this depending on your preferences. You could experiment with the different ways that it does this. Most cameras have something called evaluative metering, which means that it's taking into account a lot of different things about the brightness it's seeing in different parts of the image and making a decision based on that. But for certain situations, like if something's really well backlit a lot, you might not want evaluative metering. You might want to change it to a different one. Okay. So this slide just sort of summarizes things in a way that's really easy to digest. If you want control the depth of field, shoot in aperture priority. If you want to capture subject in motion, shoot in shutter priority. And when light is very low, set the ISO pretty darn high. If there's just 3 things to remember from this presentation, those are the 3 things. So I didn't really give people enough chance to actually practice doing these things. But hopefully you've actually tried changing the setting on your camera to one of these things and taking a photo in the room to see how it works. But are there questions about how to use these different settings or to find it on your camera or anything like that?
And folks, feel free to hold down your space bar to unmute yourself and jump in.
I've got a question, Eric.
Yeah.
What's the effect on depth of field of changing focal length in a zoom lens?
Changing focal length.
Yeah, so a zooming wide or telephoto.
Yeah, well,
What's the
yeah,
depth of field?
that's a very important issue. Yeah, the smaller focal length lenses have greater depth of field automatically. And so you don't need to worry about depth of field so much when you're using a wide angle lens. Like at the very extreme end of things, like a 14 millimeter lens, depth of field is not much of an issue at all. Most things will be in focus just because of the way the lens is designed. At the opposite end, like a 300 millimeter lens, depth of field is very important. It's very sensitive to aperture. Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. Another
Thank you.
important consideration. Other questions? Were people able to find these different settings on their camera and actually use them? Yeah,
I see Bonnie, yeah.
Bonnie saying yes. Okay, good. So you know, the way to practice with all this is to go out and take lots of photos. Try the different modes. See what happens when you're using aperture priority versus shutter priority. Just maybe try to actually take pictures of things that are moving and see how that works for you. Try what you need to do when you're in pretty low light situations. See what the camera's doing to compensate for those things. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Eric. You're getting some very nice thank yous on the chat. So you want to take a look at that. So people are really appreciating your description of the different features on their cameras.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. Thank you very much on behalf of everybody.